Now, I really like the X-Men movies, 1, 2 and 3. I also really like X-Men First Class, but X-Men Origins Wolverine was a massive disappointment. Not because it was particularly bad, but it was very bland. So when I heard that Darren Aronofsky was signed on to do the Wolverine, the sequel, this movie, I was very excited, and then before it went into production, I think when it was still in the scripting stages, Darren Aronofsky dropped out and was replaced by James Mangold, who's done like 3:10 to Yuma and stuff. And I became a bit worried. Then I saw the trailer to this film and I was even more worried. I thought it looked like the Blade Trinity of X-Men movies. Now, this film I actually found to be one of the most interesting that I've seen in a long time. There's quite a lot to say about this movie because it wasn't as bad as I feared, but it wasn't as good as I hoped, and it certainly wasn't as good as the character deserves, but it was a lot better than that last Wolverine movie. So the plot follows Logan, Wolverine, after the events of X-Men 3, which, if you haven't seen, spoiler alert, at the end of that film he had to kill Jean Grey, who became the Phoenix. Logan was the only person able to kill her because of the powers, and he's now living with that guilt. And this is why he's like living off the land and sleeping rough and all the rest of it. He's tracked down by the employee of an old Japanese soldier who became a pharmaceutical entrepreneur, whose life was saved by Logan back in World War II when an atomic bomb was dropped on a Japanese city. That's where the film actually starts, with that scene of Logan in the POW camp and the bomb coming down. As soon as that scene started, I was sort of taken aback by how good that scene was. It felt very epic. There was lots of tension building up because you know what's coming. And I looked at it and I thought, bloody hell, like this looks like it's out of a David Lean movie. This is a big scene. Now, it's never really sort of continued on past that scene, the epic feel of the movie, because it is a very sort of intimate movie and disciplined film that focuses on Wolverine. So essentially he goes over to Japan to say goodbye to his old friend Yoshida, who offers him, and this isn't a spoiler because it's in the trailer, he offers Wolverine mortality. Basically says, I can make it so that you can die, because I know it must be painful to see all the people that you love die around you, because Wolverine is immortal and cannot be killed. So straight away I'm thinking, this is really interesting, because, you know, that's how you add a sense of threat and tension to a Wolverine movie. You make him vulnerable. That was one of the problems with X-Men Origins Wolverine, but that's besides the point. So I thought that was really interesting. All the sort of meanwhile, I'm thinking, you know, this is really, you know, stylistically and tonally a lot more disciplined than the other Wolverine movie. It's not as mutant heavy. It's, I think there's only a couple of mutants in this. The villains are largely the Japanese mob, the Yakuza, which I really liked. I thought it's good to see a sort of more disciplined X-Men movie, because X-Men Origins Wolverine definitely felt like an excuse to have another X-Men movie with a team of mutants that weren't particularly good or interesting. So that I really liked. I really liked the dynamic between Logan and Yoshida, and thought that their friendship, or the idea of their friendship, was very interesting. And it's made very clear that Yoshida has told his grandchildren through the years about, you know, the Wolverine who saved his life. And I thought that it was really sort of, it added a dimension to the film that you don't sort of often get with large tentpole comic book movies. So that I really liked. There's actually, it's surprising how little action is in this compared to a lot of recent blockbusters. There's probably 3 or 4, I think 4 main set pieces in this. The first 3 of which are absolutely brilliant, I thought. There's a shootout at a funeral, a foot chase and a fight on a bullet train, all of which are glimpsed in the trailer. And that's a criticism, is that you saw basically, you know, a lot of the film in the trailer. But why these set pieces work for me is that the film takes its time in establishing the characters, although not really Wolverine, because obviously this is the 5th or 6th movie we've seen him in. the sixth, I believe. So they don't have to establish his characters. So they take some time establishing the minor supporting characters. They make you care enough so that when the action kicks off, you're actually invested in what's going on. The action's very well shot, well staged. I really liked it. I guess one sort of criticism is that stylistically the film's very pedestrian. There aren't many stylistic ticks that give it its own personality, but it's well shot, it's nice to look at. It's digital photography. Every so often there are certain shots that can look a little bit cheap and dodgy, but that's just the nature of digital photography. So for the most part, I cared about the characters in these action set pieces. I cared about what was going on. I was invested in the film, and I really, really enjoyed it. You have a character, I believe, called Yuriko, who is sort of Logan's almost sidekick in this movie, and she can see the deaths of characters. She can see how people are going to die, and that's her power. And I thought, that's quite an interesting power. It must be really shit to have, be able to see people's deaths, and that's the only thing she can see. So I thought that was interesting. There's just enough there to sort of tie it into the pre-existing X-Men franchise without it feeling too heavy. It's very much a standalone movie, and it works as a standalone film, and I think you could go into this not having seen the other X-Men movies. And, to begin with, you might be a little bit confused, but the film definitely, smooths out all the creases for those people who haven't seen the X-Men film. So I think it works as a standalone movie, and I did really like that. The only thing is, the first two acts of this movie, I was really with it. I was really enjoying it. I thought, this is such a surprisingly good movie. I'm really, really enjoying it. Then you get to the third act. Now, up until this point, Logan has gone across to Japan to say goodbye to Yoshida. Needless to say, Logan ends up having to protect Yoshida's granddaughter called Mariko, I believe. Now this storyline is based on a Chris Claremont, Frank Miller run in the comics in the 80s, which I haven't read. So I know, a lot of the criticisms I may have of this movie may, be prevalent from the source material, but I can't really comment on that because I've not read it. So essentially you have, it's not really a spoiler because, again, I think it's fairly evident in the trailer, but Mariko and Logan's relationship becomes sexual. And I think you lose a certain element of the dynamic that made it interesting. That, Logan felt obliged to protect this girl because he was friends with her grandfather. And then, he has sex with her. And it also contradicts her character because we establish up until that point that she's very traditional and she's about to enter into an arranged marriage, and yet she jumps into bed with Logan. And it's just sort of contradictory of the, to the characters' natures, that they establish not only in this movie but with Logan in the other films, and you just think it doesn't really fit with the movie. Even if that happens in the source material, I don't think it fit with the film. So that I didn't really like. And in the third act, Mariko's relegated to nothing more than the damsel in distress. And there is literally a scene where she's been held captive in a tower and she's on the balcony looking at Logan coming up to save her. And we're literally one step away from her, throwing her sort of bellowing hair over the edge so we can climb up it, like Tangled or some shit. Now, I understand that maybe the reason they did that, and I've discussed this with people who've seen the film, is that, Japanese folklore very much revolves around the damsel in distress. I don't really know an awful lot about Japanese folklore, but, if that's the case, whatever. I just feel with the damsel in distress plotline, it's been done to death. I mean, have we not outgrown it? I don't like it in movies where the sort of lead female character has to be saved by the male. It just seems lazy and outdated and almost sexist. Why did we have to go that way? Speaking of the representation of sort of women in this movie, there is one character called Viper, a blonde white woman, because obviously it's set in Japan, but she's a blonde white woman who is essentially just doing an impression of Uma Thurman in Batman and Robin. She's there as nothing else than the seductress. Her motivation, even her powers, are never fully established. And she's there as, what is she there for? Just eye candy for teenage boys. She doesn't really do anything. She has no real effect on the story. The effects that she does have could have quite easily been brought about some other way. I just felt she was a completely unnecessary character and presence. I didn't think the actress was particularly good. You could have easily cut Viper out of the film altogether and you wouldn't have lost anything. The fact that the female characters barely ever speak to each other, and when they do, it's only ever about Logan or the grandfather. I don't know, it just felt like the female characters in this, and this is only really a problem in the third act, or that's when it's most noticeable. They're there as nothing more than cardboard cutouts, you know, to have for Logan to sort of, you know, have as a trophy or as a motivation, and it's just weak storytelling to me. So that's a major criticism. The film is, you know, it does have a lot of CGI in it. I mean, the bullet train sequence is quite CGI, but it's very sort of creative and inventive, and it shows Logan having to work out how to defeat somebody in an action scene, and that's quite interesting. I always find that sort of thing interesting, you know, seeing how characters work their way through an action scene. However, the third act is so CGI heavy, you literally feel like watching a video game, where Logan, and again this is in the trailer, is fighting a big silver samurai robot thing made out of adamantium. And you just feel like watching a video game. It's nothing you haven't seen in comic book movies before. You know, for a film that was so sort of different and disciplined and interesting and really took its time to earn its set pieces, it suddenly chucked a bucket of cliches at the wall to see what would stick, and it lost its way towards the end. The third act of this movie is so weak that it literally knocked stars off the final score for me. I mean, I don't rate movies now, you know, out of 5 stars or whatever, because I don't see the point, but it definitely affected my overall enjoyment of the film, the weakness of its third act. I mean, the third act as well, you know, you have like 2 or 3 different fights happening all at once, and it feels very disjointed and very splintered, and there's no sort of emotional through line through these action sequences in the third act. Whereas in the other set pieces in the movie it honestly feels like a different film. It feels like perhaps, you know, the ending that they had may have been too dark or too violent, and the studio said, oh no, we need some comic book stuff, chuck a big robot in there, and I'm not going to go into exactly what that thing is because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. But when it's revealed, you know, when the villain is revealed and all the rest of it, it undoes a lot of what made the film interesting in the first place. They sacrifice certain character dynamics in order to have a twist. And again, that might have been in the source material, but it didn't work in the film. I definitely felt like it sacrificed its more interesting elements for a cheap twist ending, and that really annoyed me, if I'm honest. I mean, there's a lot to say about this movie. I mean, the characters of Yuriko and Mariko, and I hope I'm getting their names right, it's never really, their relationship's never fleshed out beyond small talk. There's a lot of seeds planted throughout the first 2 acts that seem to be dropped in favour of a cliched, CGI-laden third act finale. And I thought it was a shame. I thought the film would have been so much better if it stuck to what it established in the first 2 acts. Having said that, overall I did really enjoy the film. It was a lot better than I was expecting, having seen what I thought was an awful trailer. And I would recommend fans of X-Men go see it. If you do go see this film, stay until after, or about halfway through the credits. You have the sort of token post-credit scene, which I won't tell you what happens, but it basically sets up X-Men Days of Future Past. So that was quite good. Although I wish they'd stop doing that, because people were getting up out of the seats and stuff, and then the scene kicked in and everybody was stood everywhere in the theatre, and I wish they'd stop doing post-credit scenes. Put them in the film. If you want them in the film, put them in the film. So yeah, overall, the Wolverine, I thought, for the most part, for the first 2/3, very interesting, very disciplined, it adds certain elements to the Wolverine character that we've not seen yet in the films, and I really enjoyed it. The third act is quite frankly shit. But overall, it's an entertaining film, it's an above average film, and it's still better than X-Men Origins Wolverine. So if you're a fan of X-Men, I recommend go see it, and it does get you a little bit excited for the next one.